This morning, we are going to be talking about serving transgender survivors in shelter, um, and kind of some of the unique challenges and barriers to services that transgender survivors often face. So first things first, as we get started here, I want to make a few notes on language. In particular, some of the language that I'm going to be using this morning, and some of the language that I hope that you all incorporate into your vocabularies and into the work that you do. So first, let me make the distinction that gender is not a reflection of sexual identity. So being transgender does not imply any specific sexual orientation. Transgender people may identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. So this morning we are specifically talking about gender identity, okay? And we are not talking about sexual identity. So again, a transgender person, just like anyone else, can identify as any number of sexual orientations. And if you are interested on learning more about sexual identity and working with folks on the LGBT spectrum within shelter, we do have a recording of the webinar that we did last week on sexual identity and orientation within shelter that is available to you. Let me also note that gender identity, I'm going to talk about that a lot today. That's at the core of the conversation that we're having. And gender identity is one's concept of themselves as male, female, both, neither. It's really how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. One's gender identity can be the same or different from their sex or gender assigned at birth, okay? And so gender, as we think of it, just like sexual orientation, exists on a wide spectrum, and many people identify in different ways. Let me also say this, transgender is a noun that is both singular and plural. So we are talking about a transgender person or transgender people. So it's not transgendered. There's no ED on the end. So when I talk about transgender, it may be singular or plural. And it may be shortened sometimes into trans. That's just an abbreviated version. So for example, trans person, trans folks, a trans man or trans woman. And so there are some other labels or identities that people may also identify with on sort of this gender spectrum. So things like gender nonconforming, where an individual may not behave in a way that conforms to traditional gender expectations, or whose gender expression doesn't fit neatly into a male-female category. You may have someone who identifies as genderqueer, and that is typically people who sort of reject notions of gender categories and embrace a more fluid understanding of their gender identity. They may see themselves as being both male and female, neither male nor female, or falling completely outside of those categories. Agender, maybe somebody who doesn't identify necessarily with any gender at all, or hasn't really placed themselves on a part of the spectrum. And gender fluid may be somebody who identifies with different aspects of male and female gender. Okay, so again, people who do not necessarily have what we might think of as a standard identity or expression of their gender. They're thinking about it in very fluid terms across the spectrum. So just like there is a term transgender for people who do not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, there is the term cisgender, and basically what cisgender means is that you do identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. So you are cisgender or you are not trans. You do identify with the gender that you were assigned. And then the term gender dysphoria. I think this is an important term to understand when we're working with trans folks. And what gender dysphoria is it's the distress caused when a person's assigned birth gender is not the same one that they identify with. So oftentimes when people are talking about trans folks or talking about being transgender, a common example that's often used is, someone is a woman trapped in a man's body or a man trapped in a woman's body. And for a lot of us who are not transgender, who are cisgender, we have a really hard time conceptualizing what it might feel like to not identify with the gender that we were assigned when we're born, to not identify with some of the physical characteristics that we have. And so a great example that I heard recently, a way to kind of help cisgender folks understand this feeling is, don't think of it as, what if you wanted to be a different gender? Think of it as, what if as a male or as a female, the whole rest of the world was telling you that you were the opposite gender. So I am a cisgender woman. So in this example, it would be as if everyone else in the world was telling me that I could not exist as a woman, right? So think of it as you are who you are, man, woman, but everyone else is telling you you can't be that. You can't identify that way. You can't understand yourself that way. You can't name yourself and your body in that way. And think of the hurt and harm it would cause you for everyone else in the world to tell you that you could not be who you are. Okay? So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense and makes it a little bit more understandable and relatable to individuals who have not experienced this feeling. Right? So I also want to caution you that while terms are crucial, in that to be culturally competent, we need to find out what terms a person uses and refer to them with those terms. We need to reflect their own terminology back to them. And the use of a client's terms tells them that you are listening closely and that you respect their right to self-define. So in those ways, terms are crucial. But terms by themselves are meaningless. What you really need to know about transgender people in order to serve them appropriately isn't going to come from an identity term, but from asking specific questions related to their needs, concerns, and experiences, just like you do with all other clients, right? So just saying, okay, I listened to you, I'm going to use your appropriate pronouns, but I am going to, put you in this sort of box of stereotypes and of my understanding of what you might need without listening to your experiences and your needs is not helpful. And so in this case, terms can include identity labels, experiences, personal history, body part names, pronouns. So again, just getting those correct, while yes, they are a crucial and important component to being respectful, you can't stop there. You have to treat every client as a whole and complete, multifaceted person that brings their own needs, concerns, and experiences to the table. And you have to work with them as individuals who need different types of advocacy related to their experiences. So, why are we talking about this anyway? How big is the problem, right? Well, Gallup polling and the Williams Institute report that around 1% of the population identifies as transgender. Now, we also know that in polling like this that is related to identity, people are much less likely to actually identify as transgender or really anywhere on the LGBT spectrum for fear that it is not as anonymous as they think it is or as they say it is. So what we know from other research is that this 1% number is probably a little bit low. But even if this 1% number is perfectly accurate, what that means is there are around 66,000 trans people in Tennessee alone. And that's a huge number. And it's an even bigger number when you look at the rate of victimization. Researchers, including the CDC, often exclude trans individuals from their analysis or offer only binary gender identity categories. So they either exclude trans people altogether or exclude any gender expression or identity that is not rigidly male or female. However, 2 large studies have shown significantly greater risk of intimate partner violence among trans and genderqueer people. What those studies showed is that about 51% of transgender individuals have experienced intimate partner violence versus about 34% of cisgender. So this is a huge, huge problem and a huge concern among the transgender population. They are much more vulnerable to both domestic violence and sexual violence. And it's important to also note that in a 2014 national study, more than half of transgender individuals who tried to access homeless and emergency shelters were harassed by staff or residents, and almost 29% were turned away altogether. So you have this huge portion of the transgender population who are being victimized through domestic violence or sexual assault or both. And you have those who are trying to seek shelter and safety services being either harassed and discriminated against or being wholesale turned away from services altogether. So that is the issue. That is the fear and the problem. So if you look at that estimated about 66,000 trans individuals total in Tennessee, and you look at the rates of victimization I just talked about, that means we have about 33,000 trans folks living in Tennessee who are survivors of domestic violence. Over 33,000. And I want you to let that sink in for a minute. Over 33,000 trans folks alone that are victims of violence. And I also want you to think about how many trans folks that you know of that you've served within your shelter. Now, obviously, I would say that you've served trans folks that you didn't know were transgender or that you didn't know were gender nonconforming. You've served folks that were afraid to be out or felt that it was unsafe to be out with their gender identity. However, if you look at this rate of over 33,000 people being survivors of domestic violence within our state, and you compare that to the scale of people that we are actually serving in shelters and crisis centers, we have a huge, huge problem. It's critical for victim service agencies to publicly counter the myth that only some survivors are worth believing and caring for. The reality is that organizations should be serving all victims of violence. When a survivor is unable to access an agency, whether because of rejection, discrimination, fear, then that agency has simply and frankly failed in its mission. Providing gender-integrated services is a key way to provide safety and healing for all survivors. So if we're talking about reasons to integrate our services to include victims of all genders, number one, that aligns with the values of our field. Our goal is to help survivors get basic needs met, to increase well-being and safety and personal agency, and to offer resources and options for building a future that is free of violence. None of these goals are gender specific. In fact, these goals shouldn't be impacted by gender at all. People of all genders experience intimate partner violence and other abuses, and people of all genders deserve help and support in breaking the cycle of abuse. Trans women, trans men, gender nonconforming and non-binary individuals, and other trans people often, if not always, struggle to access shelters. There's, again, 29% of people being turned away altogether, almost 50% being discriminated against by staff and residents. 42% have been forced to stay in facilities designated for the wrong gender. So you have trans women who are being forced to stay in male-only facilities, and you have trans men who are being forced to stay in women-only facilities, which puts them in more danger, causes more harm and stress to the individual. Not only are they re-traumatized by having to choose or being forcibly assigned to female or male-specific services, they're much more likely to avoid seeking care altogether because they fear having to out themselves and be put in more danger. Although some gender-segregated services for survivors of intimate partner violence can be valuable, it's also easy for them to perpetuate gendered stereotypes about abuse. And so there are all of these harmful myths that only women experience abuse, and that therefore shelters should be women only, or that transgender people are often perpetrators, which is not at all the case. Again, statistically, through a lot of research, we know that trans folks are much more likely to be victimized than they are to perpetrate against anyone. Gender integrated shelters report that the mix of different genders is healthy. It helps people gain a new understanding of others, and build relationships across lines of gender and sexuality. And let's be clear, in shelter, one of our goals is to prepare individuals to live in a world outside of shelter, to live independently and empowered on their own. And we're trying to empower them to live in a world where people of other genders and sexual identities exist. And so shielding them from those or segregating them from those other people within shelter is doing a disservice to the clients that we are there to help and to nurture. And integrating our shelters avoids re-traumatization of trans people. Many trans folks have, again, reported rejection, discrimination, harassment, and mistreatment by service providers. No one should be subjected to these experiences when they are the most vulnerable and in need of help. And if all of those other reasons don't convince you, then let me be clear. It's the law. Serving trans folks within shelter, serving people of all gender and sexual identities is the law. The Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013 added a grant condition that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender or sexual orientation. The Department of Justice made it clear that this change puts the burden on agencies funded by OVW and VAWA to clearly articulate why any sex-segregated programming is necessary. And the idea that we do it because it's always been done this way is unacceptable. Agencies with segregated services must now explain why their services are segregated and how they are providing equal services to people of all genders. So if your idea of equal services is, well, people who are not cisgender women are put in hotels, right? A lot of agencies hotel trans folks as well as male victims. Number one, if your agency has, let's say, a 45-day, guaranteed stay or time limit or whatever you want to call it, can you also house someone in a hotel for 45 days? Because if not, that's not an equitable service. If your agency offers on-site advocacy, 24-hour advocacy, support groups, other things within your shelter, how are you providing those equally to individuals who are being put up in hotels? If your agency, as you are supposed to, are providing food, toiletries, and other things within shelter, how are you providing those same resources in a hotel? So hoteling is not an equitable solution, but it's something that people are often using within agencies. And so we really need to rethink this idea of what is equal and what is equitable and how we are making sure every survivor has access to the same level of services. And that includes being sure that staff are trained to not discriminate, to not harass, to be respectful of all people. And the best way to be sure that your services are equitable is to integrate them, right? To make sure that they are serving victims of all sexual orientations and gender identities within the same space. Because even after the reauthorization of 2013, as recently as a 2015 study by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, found that 44% of LGBTQ folks who sought refuge at shelters were denied access, with the most common reason being barriers related to gender identity. So again, this continues to be an ongoing struggle that is happening within our agencies, even though there are laws in place to prevent this type of discrimination. So we have to really examine our agency's work. I also just want to mention that both PHPSA and VOCA echo these VAWA non-discrimination languages and say that funding must be accessible to all eligible survivors, which means that access to service must be given consistent with the individual's gender identity, which means that you cannot force someone to stay. Again, you cannot force a trans woman to stay in a male-only facility. That puts them in more danger. And we must offer equal shelter and services and crisis services and advocacy services to all victims regardless of gender or sexual orientation. So here's, I think, a good quote that kind of sums it up. And this is from some research that the organization Forge Forward, which is a national TA provider on transgender related victimization and issues. And so they were interviewing shelter staff, and one of them said, some of the women who had male abusers were afraid the men in shelter were abusers. But once people got to know each other, it's never a problem. The women learn about the men and trans folks, and they realize they have shared experiences, and it's been hugely positive. So at the end of the day, whatever the reason is that victim services organizations ultimately decide to change how they do business, those that take the step of integrating their services to support people of all genders provide a lifeline to those in need who may well have nowhere else to turn. And again, if you have any questions about what we've talked about so far, go ahead and put it in your chat box and I'll answer any questions that you have. But we're going to turn now to talking a little bit about the tactics of power and control that are unique to transgender individuals. So the things that abusers use against their victims are sometimes unique when their victim is a trans person. There are things that can be used to threaten or isolate transgender individuals that are a little bit different. So we're going to talk about a few of those. In examples of emotional abuse that are unique to trans folks, questioning the validity of the survivor's gender identity. You're not really a man, or you're not really a woman. Controlling what someone wears or how they express their gender, right? Not letting them dress in a way that corresponds with their gender identity. Using name calling, using transphobic slurs, using the wrong pronouns or the wrong names for the survivor, pressuring a partner to come out, to make their gender identity known publicly, convincing the survivor that there is danger in going to get help, that no shelter will take you because you're transgender, or no crisis center, no advocates, no law enforcement will help you because of who you are. Withholding hormones needed for gender transition. So if I am transitioning, if the survivor is transitioning, there's very specific medication that they need to take, including hormones. So if we're withholding those or other medication, refusing to let their partner heal or rest from gender transition related surgeries, and that is, sometimes can be a very difficult and invasive surgery, and so not letting their partner heal or using their more vulnerable state against them post-surgery, public displays of affection in areas that are not LGBTQ friendly to intimidate or scare the partner, threats to out the victim's transgender status at work, at school, to their faith community, to their family, in any way that might be really both physically and emotionally damaging for them. It can be very incredibly dangerous to have your transgender status outed to people or in places that are not transgender friendly. Again, trans folks have the highest rates of both domestic violence victimization and sexual assault victimization across the LGBT spectrum. Most of the hate crimes used against trans folks are sexual in nature, so it's incredibly difficult and damaging and dangerous oftentimes. We had a question that says, can I ask you to repeat the transgender community stats around who requested shelter and were denied? Are those Tennessee stats? Those statistics are nationwide statistics. Tennessee statistics are comparable. So that is, roughly 50% of trans folks have experienced domestic or sexual violence. Of those folks who do reach out to shelters or crisis centers, about 40% reported experiencing discrimination, abuse, and harassment. About 30% were turned away altogether. And in Tennessee, those statistics, I would say, are comparable or potentially even a little bit higher. So again, more examples of trans-specific power and control tactics used against trans survivors. Not respecting words used to describe the parts of the survivor's body, not respecting body boundaries, forcing the partner to have sex in a way that doesn't align with their gender identity, using this idea that real men want sex all the time, so if you were really a man, you would have sex with me. So those are all very damaging ideas because they're, not only using someone's gender identity against them, but using their gender identity as a weapon to hurt them. Getting someone fired from their job, which can be easier if the partner is the same gender. Again, if you if you call in and quit on behalf of your partner, pretend to be your partner, and call in and make them lose their job. It's much easier if you have the same kind of voice that you can pretend to be the other person. Threatening to out the partner to their employer or to parents or relatives if those family members are helping to pay for things like tuition or housing. And trans folks may have, and many do have, additional fears specifically related to their welcome into and safety once in shelter. Transgender individuals disproportionately experience violence perpetrated by cisgender folks. Trans people face many dangers, including interactions with transphobic individuals, widespread cultural beliefs that shelters only serve cis women, and the common practice of agencies only accepting non-trans women into shelter. This results in many trans survivors being hesitant, if not downright fearful, of trying to access emergency housing, of trying to access, law enforcement protection, of trying to access crisis centers. It's the responsibility of victim service agencies to consider safety of trans individuals from their abuser, as well as shelter residents and staff, as paramount in their placement in shelter and their receipt of advocacy services. Okay, so let me just kind of revisit something that I just said that I think is incredibly important for us to understand when we're working with trans folks. It's that, again, transgender individuals disproportionately experience incredibly high levels of violence perpetrated by non-trans people. Okay? So, what we know is, I'm going to use bathroom bills as an example because that's something that has been in the news a lot over the past couple of years and is still happening. And it's this idea that preventing transgender individuals from using the restroom that corresponds with their gender identity is somehow protecting non-transgender individuals from abuse or harm in some way. But the reality is, the statistics we know are that there is not one single case of transgender individuals, someone who actually identifies and lives as a trans person, committing violence against a non-trans person in a restroom. However, there are many cases of transgender folks being hurt, sexually assaulted, even killed in restrooms and other places by cisgender individuals. So, when we talk about this idea, this fear that coming into shelter can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, for trans folks than staying with their abuser, this is actually a very valid fear and something that, as shelter staff, as victim service staff, you have to think about and address when you are considering serving all victims. Because to simply say our agency is open to all victims without taking the steps to ensure safety, train staff, and we're going to talk about some of these best practices in just a moment, but to not take those steps is making your shelter, making your space unsafe for these survivors, both physically and emotionally unsafe. So again, these are the things, or some of the things, that are preventing folks from trying to access shelter, trying to access crisis response or law enforcement response when they are being abused, okay? This idea that, first of all, crisis centers and shelters don't help men or don't help trans victims, that trans victims will be outed if they come forward, and that, again, shelters are dangerous places for transgender survivors, and these are things that we have to deal with as victim service programs in order to be ethically, faithfully, and completely serving all victims regardless of their gender identity. So, best practices. Number one, make sure you have open and ongoing conversations with staff as well as residents. One of the most important and effective ways to prepare and address concerns is through ongoing education and frank discussions with staff and residents alike. In staff meetings, training, strategic planning sessions, and through day-to-day operations, keep in mind that when staff handle situations with residents appropriately, residents will be respected and will follow the lead of staff when interacting with trans and non-binary residents. Okay. So, following along from that, hold trainings for staff. Make sure that you are training your staff on cultural competency and making sure that that includes transgender concerns and issues. Form partnerships with agencies that are doing related work within your communities. Reach out and develop or deepen relationships with agencies and groups that are already working with trans folks, whether that is, a support group or a community center in your area. Think about agencies that serve minority populations, such as disability organizations, which often have more experience working with many genders. Look for LGBT community centers and health centers that are welcoming to LGBT folks. Again, transgender support groups, and reach out to them and, look at ways that you can collaborate and share resources. Update your policies and procedures. Make changes to things like, gender neutral terminology. Make sure that you have non-discrimination policies and language that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Make needed changes to housing arrangements. So think about, privacy for transgender folks who may not be out and therefore may not want to have to change in front of a roommate, or may have to do certain things like, shaving every day, or, for some trans women, makeup is not only, something that is for aesthetics or for beauty, it's a very essential piece of their gender identity in terms of making sure that they are accepted as a woman. Expand existing resource and referral list. You cannot just refer transgender survivors to any old therapist, to any old doctor. So you can't necessarily refer trans folks to the same mental and physical health care that you have been using to refer all of your other non-transgender clients. Finding therapists, counselors, doctors who are friendly and supportive of the transgender community is incredibly important, because there are many healthcare professionals that are just as discriminatory, just as bigoted as anyone else, and referring someone to a health care or mental health professional that is going to be harmful for their mental health, it's going to treat them unkindly or as if they're inferior, is incredibly damaging and re-victimizing. So make sure that you are researching your referrals and making sure that you are referring people to individuals who are welcoming, who are open, who are understanding. I have some resource lists that I'm happy to share with you if you are having trouble finding those resources within your community. But be thoughtful about where you're referring individuals. Create or revise resident handbooks or intake guides to include non-discrimination, to include the fact that you serve people of all genders, to include the fact that you are LGBT friendly, so that this is something that is communicated to residents immediately. Right off the bat, residents understand. Make sure that you are using gender-neutral terminology. So maybe survivors instead of women. Make sure that you are using a variety of pronouns in your outreach materials. Think about the term abusive partner as opposed to man or batterer. Make sure that you are respectful and modeling inclusion, so the use of proper pronouns, that you are modeling respectful communication, that you are setting a good example for other staff and residents. Think about stocking up on transgender specific toiletries and other supplies, things that can be used by multiple genders. So think about expanding if you provide any kinds of clothing or undergarments, think of expanding the sizes and types. Think about hats or head coverings or even wigs. Many trans women use these types of things to help them look and feel more aligned to their gender identity. Think about toiletries, including types of deodorant and shampoo that you are buying these things. Maybe buying some kind of unisex options of shampoo and conditioner, things that are not overly, floral fragranced, that anybody can use. Again, for many trans and non-binary people, makeup can be essential not only for presenting themselves in a way that helps them feel like themselves, but also in providing safety from violence by helping them be seen by others as the proper gender, as the gender which they identify with. So think about also makeup among your toiletry items. And also, body modification materials, things like breast binders or breast forms, and different things like that. And I will say that Forge Forward, again, is a great resource for some tips lists, and they have an entire tip sheet that's on, trans-specific shelter supplies and some ideas of things that you might want to look into for providing for your shelter. Be thoughtful in safety measures taken to protect trans and other minority survivors. So again, maintaining confidentiality with respect to identity and experiences. Just because a survivor might be comfortable coming out as transgender to a staff member doesn't mean that they want necessarily all staff to know, and doesn't mean that they are open to being out to residents if we're talking about a shelter setting. So just because they come out to one person doesn't mean they're out to all people. Communicate respect. Discuss housing options and be respectful of the concerns that transgender people might have about sharing housing or sharing rooms with other folks. Because again, that's a very real danger. And so, many people might be perfectly fine with it and they might be happy to share rooms, but many people might be rightfully really nervous or scared or concerned about that, and you should be respectful of their concerns. And establish clear and communicated procedures for reporting harassment and bullying. Make sure that people know that if they're experiencing harassment, that it will be taken care of, that there are ways for them to report that it's not tolerated. And honestly, a very simple thing that you can do is to communicate with all residents as they are entering your shelter or as they are as you're doing an intake into any kind of advocacy services, communicating right up front that you are an agency that serves all people, including trans folks, including people of different gender identities and sexual orientations. That way that everyone knows what to expect from your agency and from your shelter right away, that they are not surprised that your shelter is open, it's inclusive, it's safe and respectful. And really think about being prepared to address discrimination, because it's going to happen. Whether it's discrimination against trans folks, against people of different sexual orientations, against people of different races or ethnicities. Be prepared to address these types of discrimination and think of, as staff, how and what you're going to do to address them, so that when it happens, you're prepared. So again, really thinking about how you're providing equitable, safe, respectful services to all people. So here are a few tips for addressing and preventing discrimination within shelter. Some really small, basic things to give you a few good ideas. Number one, again, make sure you inform clients in advance that the shelter is gender integrated, that you accept people of all gender identities, sexual orientations, ethnicities, immigration status, all of that way they have very clear expectations and understandings. Keep expectations for staff and clients clear and firm. We do not accept discrimination. We do not accept harassment. We do not accept slurs or, abusive language, just like we don't accept physical violence within shelter. Empower staff and clients to report instances of conflict or bias. Again, make sure that they know that it is safe and open for them to report. You should already be making sure that every client that you serve knows that you have a grievance policy and that you have a grievance procedure. You should already be informing them of that upon intake. So make sure that they know that they can always report issues of harassment, discrimination, bias. Educate and emphasize shared experiences. Take opportunities not only to train and educate staff, but to have conversations and educate residents as well. And emphasize the shared experiences of the residents or clients within your program. That you are all here because they have experienced some type of violence or abuse, that they are all there to heal, and that they are all there to be safe and in a safe space, and that they have these commonalities among them. Refer or rehouse the distressed person. So, according to VAWA, VOCA, and FIPSA, you cannot turn away someone because of their gender identity or sexual orientation, even if another previous resident has some distress or problem with sharing space with someone who is male or transgender or gay or whatever. The person who is distressed or upset should be the one who is either, de-escalated and talked to or rehoused. This shelter is welcome and open to everyone, to people of all genders and sexual orientations. I'm sorry you're upset by this. We are happy to help you find another agency to go to, but we will not be turning away anyone regardless of their gender identity. Okay? Again, plan your response for discrimination before discrimination happens. Make sure you know what you're going to say before it happens. Every survivor is a person first. Other identities are secondary. These identities may be relevant to the abuse and to how the survivor copes with the abuse, and to whether they have access to a support network. But for providers to see survivors as other because of their trans identity is unprofessional. It violates the most basic ethical elements of professional relationships, autonomy, beneficence, and general concern with justice and fairness. So, here is my email address. If you want additional information or additional training for yourself or for staff on these issues or any related issues. And also, again, there is the website for Forge Forward that has a ton of really amazing resources that you can kind of dig through and see if they have anything that would be helpful to your needs. So I am going to stick around for just a couple of minutes and answer questions. So if you do have any questions that you would like answered right now, go ahead and put them in your chat box. I appreciate you all for being on the webinar today. Again, I will be sending out an email that has not only the link to the recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides, but also your certificate of attendance. So watch for that coming out this afternoon. And I just wanted to remind you that once you close out your session, that an evaluation, a survey will pop up. If you can, please complete that survey. That is information that we need for our funders and feedback about the webinar today. And that survey also has a question about if you have multiple staff or multiple people from your agency listening all together. It has a place where you can list all of their names so that we make sure that we have a record of everyone who attended. So we do have one question, and that is, what type of outreach services do you recommend for rural communities when reaching out to the transgender community to ensure that we are getting the word out effectively to communities? So again, I think it's a little more difficult in rural communities because it's often harder to pinpoint those agencies or those places where transgender or LGBT folks are already being served or already kind of congregating. But think about community centers in your area. Think about even bars in your area that serve LGBT folks. Think about looking at what is on your website, what is on any brochures or things that you give out into the community. Think of the points where people find your services. So think about where survivors go to look for resources in their area. Often it's, on social media, often it's on websites. So take a look at your website and take a look at your social media, and take a look at any brochures or things that you're handing out or giving out within the community, and see if those are really conveying the fact that you are open and friendly and accepting of people of all gender identities. So are you using a variety of pronouns, or are you just using she and her when you're talking about victims, and are you just using he and him when you're talking about perpetrators? Instead, use a variety of pronouns. Are you actually talking about violence toward transgender individuals or LGBT folks? Are the images that you're using on your outreach materials diverse? Do they reflect, same gender relationships? Do they reflect even different ethnicities and different genders? Look at that and see if you are actually putting out a message of diversity and how people may be perceiving your agency. Because let me tell you, just having a rainbow sticker on the door of your office is not getting people to trust you and is not getting people to come in the door. You need to start considering those points of interest and points of contact, where folks are finding you. It doesn't look like there are any other questions. So again, if you do have questions, or if you do want more information, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm happy to speak to you about these issues. And again, look this afternoon for an email to come out with resources and your certificate of attendance.